I first saw this display of a Royal Air Force ground crew uniform at the RAF Museum in London. This video shows the recreation of the leather jerkin. I also made the knit scarf and wrote a pattern that is available on Ravelry. This jerkin pattern will eventually be available on Etsy to print at home. The jerkin is made of leather with 4 plastic buttons down the front and lined with wool fabric. This recreation was made as part of a course for my PhD at Concordia University in Montreal, supervised by Professor P.K. Langshaw. The course examined the uniform and clothing of RAF ground crew in Britain between 1938 and 1940. These 3 photos show leather jerkins issued to the British Armed Forces. The top photo is from World War I, where it appears these wool-lined leather jerkins originated as clothing for the armed services. The other 2 are World War II jerkins. Bottom left is likely Army issue and the bottom right is RAF issue. The color of the wool lining changed depending on the service where it was issued. I've learned from the extant jerkins that RAF linings appear to be either RAF blue or black wool. The leather on all of the jerkins are pieced to make full-size pattern pieces. The piecing on the World War II jerkin seemed to be more focused on the shoulder rather than the bottom, which you can see on the World War I jerkin. The only published reference to a leather jerkin in the armed forces during World War II that I was able to find is in Andrew Mollo's 1981 book, The Armed Forces of World War II, Uniforms, Insignia, and Organization. On page 70, there is an image titled, Lieutenant Commander, Royal Navy, 1941. The description reads, Commander Kimmins, on his return from a combined operations in Norway, wears a naval service dress under an army, steel helmet, and leather jerkin. I am making this jerkin to fit my dad. This in itself presents some challenges as I'm normally used to patterning on myself. I'm starting the pattern process with this vest of my dad's. I'm starting with marking the front with a pin to show where I need to draft out the V at the front. The vest is also a little bit too short, so I'll have to extend that and add overlap at the front so that it can button. I then placed the vest on my patterning paper and pulled the pattern from half of it. I added 1/2-inch seam allowance to each seam, then folded the pattern in half and traced and cut out the other side, using my slippers as weights. I traced and modified the front as well. I bought a 1/4 yard of a couple different wools from Burnley and Trowbridge, mostly because I knew that it would be 100% wool and very good quality. I used the 1/4 yard to figure out how much wool I needed to buy in order to line the jerkin. I mocked up the jerkin in canvas to simulate the quality of leather. I traced the pattern in tailor's chalk and then cut it out. I pinned the pieces together and then set my seam allowance on my sewing machine. I sewed the mock-up on my Singer, which dates from 1936 and was made in St. John's, Quebec, Canada. I don't own a clapper, so when I pressed my seams open, I used my sleeve board to keep them flat as they cooled down. While I was working on the jerkin, I was also working on the scarf. I aimed to knit 1 inch a day. This is worsted weight yarn on size 2 needles. The first fitting was done over a jacket since this jerkin is intended as outerwear. At this point, I didn't make any changes. I just wanted to make sure that the pattern pieces worked so that I knew how much leather to buy. I bought the leather at Tony Tex in Montreal. They had a selection of thin to medium weight cow leather. I tested several hides to see which one would be big enough to cut all 3 pattern pieces out of. I knew that I would have to piece at least one of the fronts. I then did another fitting and made some adjustments to the front, making it a straighter line, and then added material to the shoulders. I did this by pinning another piece of canvas to the mock-up and tracing and cutting the line I wanted.
Yeah, that's better.
These photos show the pattern after the second fitting. Then one final fitting and a few changes to the front and tested it again for range of motion. I then split the pattern and made adjustments to the paper pattern. Next step was to cut the pattern out of leather. I played with the placement of the pattern pieces to find the best use of leather. I weighed the pattern down and then tried tracing it with tailor's chalk. This did not work.
Cool. That doesn't work. Okay.
Next I tried scoring it with an awl, but I couldn't see the lines either. Finally, I used my fountain pen. This created very thin lines that were hard but not impossible to see. The left front shoulder section needed to be pieced. I folded the section over and then added 1/2-inch seam allowance to connect the two pieces. Following my folded line on the pattern, I traced the shoulder section, adding 1/2-inch seam allowance to the pieced edge. After all pieces were traced, I cut them out. Using tan cotton quilting thread, I sewed the leather on my 1936 sewing machine. This was very hard not being able to pin the materials. I pressed the seams open with a hot iron and a little bit of steam. I used a towel as a pressing cloth. I then did a fitting with just the sewn together leather. The lining was then traced, pinned, and cut out of the wool. I also added seam allowance to all the edges which didn't already have seam allowance, which was the front, the arms, and the bottom. I sewed the lining together and then pressed the seams with my iron. I used these little plastic clips to attach the lining to the leather. I folded back the wool lining 1/2 inch on all the edges and pinned them into place. I started with the front edges and the neck. I didn't have quite enough clips to do the entire jerkin in one go, so I started with those edges, and you can see I didn't really have enough clips for that either. I top stitched the lining from the inside, removing the clips as I went. I realized pretty quickly into this process that this is definitely not the way that the original jerkins were done. The clip playing now is an unedited 30-second clip that shows how tedious and time-consuming this process was. On top of all of that, this machine is definitely not made to do this kind of heavy-duty work. It's a Singer from the period, but it is definitely a domestic machine and not industrial, meant to sew through leather. None of the lines I was sewing were straight. I had to continually use the wheel on the side to adjust, and to top it off, it didn't even look good when I had finished.
This cannot be how they did it. This is not good.
After sewing the front and neck, I then used the clips to pin the bottom and the arms. If I thought sewing the front and neck was difficult, I had no idea what was coming with the arms.
So for some reason, both sides and everything has fit perfectly, except this side didn't fit. So I split the seam here because there's going to be another piece of leather going on top here to reinforce this. This is the side seam of the arm, by the way. There's another piece of leather that's going to go on here, kind of triangle, to reinforce the underarm. So I'm so frustrated with this project that I just snipped it, and I'm going to reinforce it with a piece of leather. So, I mean, in the end, only I will know it's there, and I think it'll be fine. This lining of the jerkin is one of the most frustrating things I've ever done. There is no way that this is how the originals were actually done. So at least I've learned that, and everything in me just wants to rush it, but when I rushed it, this happened. Which just looks horrible. So I'm not rushing this anymore, but it just means I'm getting even more frustrated. It's taking so long and just does not look good. It's also obvious to me when doing this that my machine is 100% not the correct machine to be doing this on. You can see it's leaving scratches on the leather. Like, this machine is wonderful and does so many great things, but it is not built to do what I am doing now.
I then sewed the lining to the arms and had a full-on crash out.
Ah. Oh my God. I swear, I'm not rushing this. I'm not rushing this. Oh, Okay. Okay, well, you know what? It's not nice, but at least it's done. Oh, Jesus. Someone take this away from me. It doesn't look very good, but it is lined. So, thumbs up, I guess. These are all the buttonhole tests that I did. So the first one I tried cutting the hole first with scissors. You can see how rough that line is. So I realized if I cut it with a chisel, I had a chisel in the correct size. If I hammered a chisel through it, it would go a lot quicker. And you can see how quickly it's fraying. I tried to fold the edges back to have like a little hemmed edge, and it was just clear that that was not going to be able to be sewn on the machine. The next one, I was like, okay, it looks as if some, but not all of the buttonholes have this extra bit of leather, so I cut a square out, sewed around the hole that I'd cut, and tried to turn it inside out, and you can clearly see that obviously didn't work. So I tried one without that extra piece, which I didn't even put it back on. I just sewed it and then cut the hole with the chisel. Look, this is a mess, but it was just to see if I had the right materials. I wasn't measuring particularly carefully. I just throw it together to see if it would work. And it did work. The button passes through it, but you can see how thick this is. It's way too thick. And this leather isn't soft enough. This other leather, the black is softer than the brown, but still it's just a mess. So the final test that I did is this one here. Based on the buttonholes in the Imperial War Museum, it does not look as if there are extra pieces. This is what the Imperial War Museum ones look like. This is what the one on the other auction website looks like. So I decided to go with the Imperial War Museum because this one also has interior pockets and a bunch of other fancy stuff that the Imperial War Museum one does not, and that was the one that I was originally basing my reconstruction off of. So this has an actual measured out piece, unlike this one where I just sort of free-handed it. And then that is top stitched. You top stitch these two lines, then these two lines, and then all around the outside. It has the lining in it, so I could see how thick it was going to be. And this is the bobbin side, and you can see that the tension is kind of not quite right. But by this point, I realized that if I messed with the tension, the whole thing would look screwy because my machine is not built to sew this kind of material. It's just not. So I decided just to leave it as it is and deal with the slightly less nice look than, say, that side. And you can see there are little threads sticking out because the edges of the lining are just raw. But I'll just trim those as I go, and the button fits through this nice and tightly because I reckon it will stretch over time. So I wanted a nice tight fit for the buttons, and this works. So I just basically replicated this 4 times onto the actual jerkin.
I measured and cut the backing for the buttonholes. I also folded and pressed on the stitching line so I could see the center and where I was supposed to sew. Additionally, I cut 4 squares for the back of the buttons. To make the sewing easier, I cut the hole in the backing first using a chisel. A friend of mine on Instagram who owns a reproduction leather jerkin sent me some measurements from his. I used these measurements for the placement of the buttonholes and buttons. I also double-checked many of my measurements while I was patterning the jerkin. First, either side of the buttonhole was stitched using the foot of the machine as a guide. Next, vertical lines were stitched either side of the buttonhole, and I sewed around the entirety of the outline of the backing. The buttonholes were then cut using a chisel and hammer. I marked the placement of the buttons using the same measurements and then checked them against the buttonholes. The place where the buttons were sewn on were backed with a little piece of leather that is top stitched around the edge. I sewed the buttons on by hand. Made a shank around the button. And then tied off the thread on the other side. The final step was to add a reinforcement to the underarm seam. You can see here how it looks on the original. I measured and cut out 2 triangles of leather. I then sewed the reinforcements using my machine. And here is the finished jerkin with the scarf.